Well, state and federal lawsuits have stopped Measure 114 from going into effect ever since voters passed it back in November.
And their recent actions against firearms manufacturers, federal firearms licenses, or FFLs.
It's important that our Constitution does have a Second Amendment.
I think that all the amendments are important. It's very hard to start comparing.
When it is fired, so it just doesn't make a whole lot of sense, and I'm sure Mr.
BANS from engaging in defense from imminent harm.
Large capacity magazines increase.
Background of Oregon Measure 114. Oregon Measure 114, also known as Senate Bill 554, is a significant piece of legislation that was passed in the state of Oregon. Enacted in 2021, this measure introduced two key provisions related to arms within the state. These provisions primarily concern the purchase of arms and the possession of large capacity mags. One of the central components of Measure 114 is the introduction of a permit system for individuals looking to purchase arms in Oregon. According to the new law, residents of Oregon are required to obtain a permit before they can legally purchase an arm. This permit is issued after the completion of several prerequisites, including the completion of a safety training course, a background check, and providing valid identification. Additionally, applicants may also be required to be fingerprinted. This process is aimed at ensuring that individuals seeking to purchase arms are adequately trained and do not pose a threat to public safety. Another significant aspect of Measure 114 is the prohibition on the sale, purchase, transfer, and possession of large capacity mags. These mags, defined as those capable of holding more than 10 rounds of ammunition, are subject to a prospective ban. This means that individuals who had possessed such mags before the law's enactment are typically grandfathered in, allowing them to keep their existing mags. However, the acquisition of new large-capacity mags is prohibited under Measure 114. The intent behind Measure 114 is primarily centered around enhancing public safety and reducing the potential for arm-related incidents. By implementing a permit system, the state aims to ensure that individuals seeking to purchase arms have undergone appropriate training and do not pose a threat to themselves or others. This measure is in line with efforts to promote responsible arm ownership and usage. The ban on large-capacity mags is motivated by a desire to limit the potential harm that can be inflicted in a short amount of time during an arm-related incident. By restricting the availability of high-capacity mags, lawmakers hope to mitigate the severity of such incidents and provide law enforcement with additional response time. Measure 114 faced significant challenges and controversies, particularly from groups advocating for arm rights. Critics argue that the term attack arm is a politically charged term and that such arms should not be subject to outright bans. They contend that these arms are in common use by millions of law-abiding citizens and therefore should not be restricted. This argument draws parallels to the landmark 2008 Supreme Court ruling that struck down a ban on arms in Washington, D.C., asserting that arms were also in common use. The legal challenges to Measure 114 have been multifaceted. One prominent case, Arnold v. Colt, represents a state-level challenge, arguing that the measure violates the state constitution of Oregon. This challenge hinges on the belief that Measure 114's provisions infringe upon the rights of Oregon residents to keep and bear arms. Additionally, there is a federal lawsuit known as the Off case, which challenges Measure 114 under federal law and the Second Amendment. This case seeks to leverage the current legal climate, including recent Supreme Court decisions, to challenge the constitutionality of the measure. While temporary injunctions have been put in place to prevent the immediate enforcement of Measure 114, the legal battles surrounding this measure continue. The outcome of these cases will significantly impact the implementation and enforcement of Measure 114's provisions within the state of Oregon. Arnold v. Colt, State Challenge. Arnold v. Colt is a crucial legal case challenging Oregon Measure 114, also known as Senate Bill 554. This state-level case, named after the lead plaintiff Eric Arnold and defendant, the director of the Oregon Department of Justice, Mark Colt, centers on the constitutionality of Measure 114 under the state of Oregon's Constitution. The plaintiffs in Arnold v. Colt contend that Measure 114 infringes upon the rights of Oregon residents to keep and bear arms, as protected by the state constitution. They argue that the measure imposes unnecessary and burdensome restrictions on law-abiding citizens seeking to exercise their Second Amendment rights. The crux of the plaintiff's argument hinges on the interpretation of the state's constitution's provisions regarding arm rights. They assert that Measure 114 exceeds the state's authority in regulating arms and imposes restrictions that are incompatible with the original intent of the Constitution's framers. In the early stages of the case, Judge Robert S. Raccio, the Harney County District Court, issued a TRO. This TRO effectively halted the implementation of both the permit requirement and the ban on large-capacity magazines. It was a significant victory for the plaintiffs as it prevented the immediate enforcement of Measure 114. One critical aspect of the case revolves around the interpretation of the term common use in the context of arms. This term plays a crucial role in determining the constitutionality of arm regulations.
Well, state and federal lawsuits have stopped Measure 114 from going into effect ever since voters passed it back in November.
The people of Oregon passed the Reduction of Gun Violence Act.
From engaging in defense from imminent harm.
Large capacity magazines increase
And their recent actions against firearms manufacturers, federal firearms licenses, or FFLs,
when it is fired. So it just doesn't make a whole lot of sense, and I'm sure Mr. Bosco.
Bans for 18 to 20-year-old adults guns that are in common use. It bans.
While supporters of Measure 114 argue that large-capacity mags are not in common use for lawful purposes, opponents contend that they are widely utilized for self-defense and other legitimate purposes. The outcome of Arnold versus Kotek carries substantial implications for arm rights and regulations in the state of Oregon. A favorable ruling for the plaintiffs could potentially result in the nullification or significant alteration of Measure 114, allowing for broader access to arms and mags. The state court trial is currently underway, with arguments presented by both sides. Testimony from various witnesses and experts is being considered in the evaluation of the case. The judge's final decision in this trial will shape the future implementation and enforcement of Measure 114 in Oregon. Arnold versus Kotek is not only of local importance, but also has broader implications for the ongoing national debate surrounding arm control measures. The case exemplifies the clash between efforts to enhance public safety through arms regulations and the protection of individual Second Amendment rights. In instant, Arnold versus Kotek stands as a critical legal challenge to Oregon Measure 114, with profound implications for arm rights and regulations in the state. The case underscores the ongoing debate over the balance between public safety and individual constitutional rights, and its outcome will significantly influence the enforcement of Measure 114 and potentially impact arm control measures on a larger scale. Off versus Kotek Federal Challenge. Off versus Kotek is a pivotal federal lawsuit challenging Oregon Measure 114, which was enacted in 2021. The measure introduces significant changes to Oregon's arms regulations, including a permit requirement for arm purchases and a ban on large-capacity mags. Off versus Kotek is distinct from the state-level case Arnold versus Kotek, as it focuses on the federal constitutionality of Measure 114. The case is named after the lead plaintiff, Sean Off, who is contesting the measure as a violation of the Second Amendment of the U.S. Constitution. The plaintiffs, led by Sean Off, argue that Measure 114 infringes upon their Second Amendment rights by imposing undue burdens on law-abiding citizens seeking to exercise their right to bear arms. They contend that the requirement for a permit to purchase arms and the ban on large-capacity mags are both unconstitutional. Central to the plaintiff's argument is the interpretation of the Second Amendment, which states, "A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed." The plaintiffs assert that Measure 114 constitutes an infringement on this fundamental right. A critical aspect of the case revolves around the concept of in common use. This term has been significant in Supreme Court rulings related to arms. The plaintiffs argue that large-capacity mags are commonly used for self-defense and other lawful purposes, and therefore banning them is unconstitutional. In this federal case, the judge ruled on the constitutionality of Measure 114. The judge's decision was that both the permit requirement and the ban on large-capacity mags are constitutional under the Second Amendment. While the state-level case Arnold versus Kotek challenged Measure 114 on state constitutional grounds, Off versus Kotek is focused on federal law, specifically the Second Amendment. This federal challenge provides a different legal avenue for contesting the measure.
But now you secretly let out what the real purpose of it is. It's to claim that Democrats want to defund.
It's important that our Constitution does have a Second Amendment.
I think that all the amendments are important. It's very hard to start comparing.
Simple. I will read, if I can find underneath all these amendments.
Bans for 18 to 20-year-old adults guns that are in common use. It bans
striking a clause in the preamble is per se germane, neither adds nor subtracts, and police
doing. If we can't save all lives, it's not worth saving a single life. Well, I suppose that
we took up bills for National Police Appreciation Week. We took up the actual bills.
The outcome of Goff versus Kotek carries implications not only for the residents of Oregon, but also for the broader national debate on arm control. It establishes a legal precedent regarding the constitutionality of measures like Measure 114, and shapes the ongoing dialogue on the balance between arm rights and public safety. Despite the federal court's decision, the legal battle surrounding Measure 114 continues. State-level challenges, such as Arnold versus Kotek and other lawsuits, may further influence the implementation and enforcement of the measure. In summary, Off versus Kotek is a significant federal lawsuit challenging the constitutionality of Oregon Measure 114. The case hinges on the interpretation of the Second Amendment and its application to arm regulations. The court's decision in this case carries broader implications for arm rights and regulations, not only in Oregon, but also in the broader national context. Testimony's crucial role. In the ongoing legal battle surrounding Measure 114 in Oregon, a critical aspect has come to the forefront. The judge overseeing the case is giving significant weight to the testimony provided regarding the practical implications of the measure. This testimony sheds light on the measure's potential contradictions and raises pertinent questions about its constitutionality. One key point of contention revolves around the prohibition of mags that hold more than 10 rounds. The state's position is that such mags are inherently dangerous and uncommon, warranting exclusion from the possession of the average law-abiding citizen for self-defense purposes. However, this argument faces a substantial challenge in the form of testimony from law enforcement officers. Remarkably, police officers and sheriffs, whose duty involves upholding public safety, are commonly equipped with mags that exceed the 10-round threshold. This stark contrast highlights a potential inconsistency in the measure's logic. If these mags are deemed essential tools for professionals tasked with maintaining public order, it raises questions about why they would be considered unfit for responsible civilians seeking to protect themselves and their homes. The state, in its attempt to bolster its case, sought to exclude this testimonial evidence. This move underscores the significance of such testimony in undermining the state's position. By attempting to prevent the judge from considering this type of evidence, the state indirectly acknowledges the potential weight it carries in revealing the measure's inherent contradictions. Reports have emerged indicating that certain portions of the state's testimony were deemed irrelevant and subsequently excluded from consideration. This development further emphasizes the critical role that relevant and substantive testimony plays in shaping the judge's perception of the case. The judge's evident inclination towards a fair and balanced assessment of the matter is noteworthy.
The gentleman from California is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 2 minutes to Jerry Nadler.
Dettelbach is the director of ATF. You do agree with President Biden, whether intentional or unintentional, of Biden administration officials and anti-gun advocates and even the president himself?
That's right. Under this bill, a conviction is not required. This will lead to bizarre consequences.
The hope among those challenging Measure 114 is that this favorable disposition towards Second Amendment rights will ultimately translate into a ruling in their favor. The judge's receptiveness to considering all relevant evidence, particularly that which illuminates potential inconsistencies in the measure, offers a promising sign for proponents of arm rights. It is crucial to recognize that this legal challenge centers on the interpretation of the Oregon State Constitution, utilizing its specific language to evaluate the measure's constitutionality. While the broader Second Amendment question is not the primary focus, the state-specific context provides a framework for assessing Measure 114's validity. As the legal proceedings progress, the temporary halt on the mag bans and permit scheme remains in effect. The culmination of this week's hearing will undoubtedly be pivotal in determining the measure's fate. The central question that looms is whether the court will ultimately strike down Measure 114, finding it to be in violation of both the Oregon State Constitution and pertinent Second Amendment language within their legal framework. This ongoing legal battle in Oregon exemplifies the intricate and nuanced nature of arm rights litigation in the U.S. Supreme Court's recent rulings on arm restrictions. In a series of recent landmark rulings, the U.S. Supreme Court has significantly shaped the landscape of arm rights in the United States. These rulings have had sweeping implications, particularly for states with existing arm restrictions. One notable decision involved the overturning of lower court rulings that had upheld arm restrictions, including bans on attack-style rifles in Maryland and limits on large-capacity ammunition mags in New Jersey and California. This thing delves into the details of these rulings, their implications for arm rights, and the potential consequences for existing arm regulations. Last week, the U.S. Supreme Court delivered a groundbreaking 6-3 ruling that expanded individual arm rights. The conservative majority justices, in opposition to their liberal counterparts, struck down New York State's restrictions on carrying concealed handarms outside the home. The court's decision was rooted in the belief that the 1913 law, which imposed limits on carrying concealed handarms, violated an individual's right to keep and bear arms, as enshrined in the Second Amendment of the U.S. Constitution. This ruling not only invalidated New York's long-standing law, but also set a precedent for how courts should evaluate the constitutionality of arm regulations moving forward. It established the requirement that such regulations must align with historically recognized restrictions throughout U.S. history, potentially paving the way for more challenges to arm restrictions on a national scale. This development is met with anticipation by legal experts, while simultaneously raising concerns among proponents of arm control.
The gentleman from California is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 2 minutes to Jerry Nadler.
Pistol, it can become a short-barreled rifle, and then it's subject under the National Firearms Act. That's what you're saying.
That's right. Under this bill, a conviction is not required. This will lead to bizarre consequences.
As a direct consequence of the recent Supreme Court rulings, lower courts that previously upheld arm restrictions are now compelled to reevaluate their decisions. This includes cases such as Maryland's ban on highly dangerous military-style attack rifles. Maryland implemented this ban in response to the tragic 2012 mass slaying at Sandy Hook Elementary School in Newtown, Connecticut, where a slayer utilized such an arm to claim the lives of 20 children and 6 adults. Maryland is one of 5 states that have instituted similar bans on these types of arms. In light of the recent Supreme Court actions, lower courts must revisit their previous rulings and assess their compatibility with the newly established standards of the Second Amendment. This development signifies a critical juncture in the ongoing debate over arm rights and restrictions. The recent Supreme Court rulings have far-reaching implications for the future of arm regulations in the U.S. By setting a precedent that demands alignment with historical standards, the court has introduced a criterion that could lead to the invalidation of numerous existing arm restrictions across the nation. This prospect raises concerns among advocates for arm control, who fear a potential dismantling of crucial safety measures. The decisions underscore the enduring tension between individual arm rights and public safety considerations. While the court's rulings strengthen the former, they also prompt a reevaluation of how best to balance these competing interests. Striking this equilibrium will undoubtedly remain a central challenge for lawmakers, legal experts, and advocates on both sides of the arm control debate. The recent rulings by the U.S. Supreme Court have reshaped the discourse surrounding arm rights and restrictions in the U.S. By overturning lower court decisions and establishing a new standard for evaluating the constitutionality of arm regulations, the court has initiated a significant shift in the legal landscape. The reconsideration of arm restrictions in states like Maryland, as well as the potential nationwide impact, underscores the critical importance of these decisions. Moving forward, finding a balance between individual arm rights and public safety will continue to be a paramount concern for policymakers and advocates alike. Supreme Court's impact on arm control laws. In recent years, attack-type rifles have become a tragic common denominator in mass slayings across the U.S. This has prompted legal challenges to arm control measures, with plaintiffs contesting the term attack arm and asserting their right to bear arms under the Second Amendment. The recent actions of the Supreme Court have reignited debates on arm control, particularly in cases involving Maryland's ban on attack arms, New Jersey and California's restrictions on arm mags, and Hawaii's limitations on openly carrying arms in public. The legal battle over Maryland's ban on attack arms began in 2020, even though the plaintiffs acknowledged the challenge precedent set by the 2017 ruling of the 4th U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals. This ruling, which upheld Maryland's ban, appeared to set a formidable barrier for the plaintiffs. Their argument hinged on contesting the term attack arm as a politically loaded label and asserting that these arms are in common use among law-abiding citizens. They drew parallels to the landmark 2008 Supreme Court ruling that struck down a ban on handarms in Washington, D.C., emphasizing the importance of arms in self-defense. The Supreme Court's decision to send the case back to lower courts indicates a nuanced approach. It suggests a willingness to engage with the complexities surrounding arm control laws, particularly in cases where constitutional rights and public safety concerns intersect. This move does not definitively endorse or refute Maryland's ban, but rather calls for a deeper examination. In addition to the Maryland case, the Supreme Court addressed bans on arm mags with capacities exceeding 10 rounds in New Jersey and California. These bans were challenged by state affiliates of the National Rifle Association, a prominent armed rights group with strong ties to the Republican Party. The court's decision to remand these cases to lower courts indicates an interest in further deliberation.
Whether intentional or unintentional, of Biden administration officials and anti-gun advocates and even the president himself. Dettelbach is the director of ATF. You do agree with President Biden that
Pistol, it can become a short-barreled rifle, and then is subject under the National Firearms Act. That's what you're saying. Pistol, it can become a short-barreled rifle, and then is subject under the National Firearms Act. That's what you're saying.
The outcome of these cases may have significant implications for arm control measures beyond Maryland. Mag capacity restrictions are a contentious issue, with proponents arguing that they can limit the potential harm in mass slayings, while opponents emphasize their importance for self-defense. The Supreme Court also examined Hawaii's restrictions on openly carrying arms in public. The lower court's decision upholding these restrictions under the Second Amendment faced scrutiny. This case brings into focus the balance between individual rights and public safety, particularly in the context of openly carrying arms. While the Supreme Court's action does not immediately change existing law, it signals a willingness to revisit the complex issue of carrying guns in public spaces. This decision may set the stage for future discussions on the extent of permissible arm rights in public areas. The recent actions of the Supreme Court underscore the intricate nature of arm control laws in the U.S. The decisions to remand cases involving attack arm bans, mag restrictions, and open carry limitations indicate a measured approach. The court appears poised to engage in a nuanced examination of these issues, considering both constitutional rights and public safety imperatives. As legal battles continue, the nation will closely monitor how these deliberations shape the future of arm control laws in America. Recent federal arm reform. The issue of arm rights in the U.S. has long been a subject of intense debate, given the nation's historical commitment to arms and the escalating levels of armed violence. The recent ruling by the Supreme Court, which invalidated New York's arm measure, represents a significant milestone in the ongoing conversation about the Second Amendment. This decision comes more than a decade after the court's groundbreaking recognition of an individual's right to possess arms for self-defense.
some liability exemption for the COVID vaccines, right?
I actually am not familiar with vaccines.
Well, some liability exemption for the COVID vaccines, right?
I actually am not familiar with vaccines.
Well, I've got here the actual original brace that this letter was responsive to.
In which someone who had no intent of harming a law enforcement officer, but nevertheless committed an act that constituted assault.
While the federal arm reform does not impose bans on attack-style rifles or high-capacity mags, it takes notable steps towards strengthening background checks. For the first time, it grants access to information regarding significant crimes committed by juveniles, offering a more comprehensive evaluation of potential arm purchasers' backgrounds. The recent developments in both the judicial and legislative realms highlight the complexity of the arm control debate in the U.S. Balancing the constitutional right to bear arms with the imperative of public safety remains a formidable challenge. The Supreme Court's decisions and President Biden's federal arm reform bill reflect a dynamic and evolving landscape, emphasizing the need for nuanced approaches to address the multifaceted aspects of arm control. The recent Supreme Court ruling and federal arm reform bill signify pivotal moments in the ongoing discourse on arm rights and control. These developments exemplify the dynamic nature of American jurisprudence and legislative action. As the nation grapples with the complexity of armed control, it is imperative to continue fostering constructive dialogues that prioritize both constitutional rights and public safety. Striking a balance between these crucial imperatives will pave the way for a more comprehensive and effective approach to armed control in the United States. That's all for this video, folks. We'll see you next time.